Hello, everybody,
Hello, everyone.
and welcome to our Carolina Live webinar. We are your presenter for today. My name is Julie,
And my name is Hiba.
and we are so thrilled to be here to facilitate this webinar. We feel grateful today, and we are so glad that you are able to join us. Especially, we know that most of you are teachers, and you know, Hiba, this time can be very busy for them. So thank you again, once again, for joining us. We hope that this webinar is worth your time. This webinar is presented by the Knowledge Hub in association with Carolina Biological Supply Company and Smithsonian Science Education Center. So the webinar is about NGSS and 3D science. And what is this NGSS, by the way, Hiba? This NGSS actually is a next generation science standard. They are a new set of K-12 science standard that actually support college and career readiness for our student. And this three-dimensional, what is this 3D science? So 3D science is about science and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts, and also disciplinary core ideas. So on this webinar, we will introduce and we will show to our attendees some of the benefits and best practices of those three-dimensional learning that integrates together. So for example, science and engineering practices with cross-cutting concepts just to deepen and also apply student understanding about science concept that we call disciplinary core ideas. So see, for today's webinar, our attendees will really see examples of those three-dimensional investigations, and of course, they will have an opportunity to ask questions. How does it sound to you, Hiba?
Actually, it sounds amazing. Now, to get us started, just a quick note about what we are going to cover today. We will introduce, as Julie said, NGSS and 3D science. We will give you a quick overview about Carolina and the Smithsonian Company. We will introduce our speakers directly from Smithsonian and Carolina, and then we will discuss teaching inquiry-based STEM education. And they will give us examples about how those products can support phenomena-based science learning. And finally, we will close with question and answer. Now, please just remember that a recorded version of this webinar will be available to you to share it out. So please feel free after this webinar is finished just to forward it along with your colleagues and share it with them.
How long this webinar, Hiba?
We will going to stay with you for the next 45 minutes.
And the chat box are open, right?
Please just put your questions there anytime. We will be happy to answer you. Now, to get you started, we are going to introduce ourselves. We are a specialized trainer, professional trainer from the Knowledge Hub company. We have several years of experience in educational industry, specialized in e-learning and inquiry-based programs. And me and Julie are representing the Knowledge Hub company, which is a Middle East indisputable leader in the educational sector for the past 20 years. Now, Knowledge Hub providing educational solution and technology integration in K-12 schools and universities. Now, Knowledge Hub also offering state-of-the-art ICT solution that will support the 21st century learning. And successfully, Knowledge Hub established international presence with partners in USA, Europe, Asia, Pacific, Africa, and also UK.
Thank you very much, Hiba, for giving quick introductions about company. Now, let me introduce to you our partner, which is Carolina Biological Supply Company. So, Carolina actually works in partnership with educators and scientists worldwide, Hiba, for over 90 years. And they have specialized products, around 12,000 products. And those products are mostly about science education because that's their main focus. Also, Carolina, they believe that students, they learn science by doing science, which is actually true. And Carolina believe in the idea that all students actually should have an opportunity to have hands-on experiences and, of course, interactions with real-world phenomena. And Carolina, they are committed to provide the best curriculum programs for K-12 schools. And Carolina, it's not just any kind of publisher or supplier, by the way. They are our trusted partner in providing the most engaging and effective science instructions. So that's how Carolina actually built it.
Oh, amazing. And for Smithsonian also, Julie, Smithsonian Science Educational Center mission is to transform K-12 education through science in collaboration with communities across the globe. Smithsonian promote inquiry-based STEM learning and teaching. Smithsonian ensure equality, diversity, accessibility, and also inclusion in K-12 STEM education. And also Smithsonian advances STEM education for sustainable development. And speaking about Smithsonian, let me introduce to you our speakers today. I'm gonna first start with the director of the Smithsonian. So Dr. Carol O'Donnell with us today to give us more information about the Smithsonian. Let me introduce to you Dr. Carol. She is the director of Smithsonian Science Educational Center. Dr. Carol O'Donnell is responsible for all operational activities and planning for the unit, including building awareness for preschool through 12th grade science educational reform, and she is conducting programs that support the professional growth of K-12 teachers and school leaders. And she is overseeing all research and curricular resource development, philanthropic development, and administration. Now, Julie, before Dr. O'Donnell joining Smithsonian, she worked at the U.S. Department of Education, where she oversaw nearly 17 billion in annual federal investments under the elementary and secondary educational art. Now, Dr. O'Donnell currently serves as a part-time faculty of George Washington University's Physics Department.
That's a huge achievement. Now, Hiba, let me introduce also to you Mr. Powell, which is also one of our speakers for today. We are so happy and glad that they're able to make us. So Mr. Powell is the international e-learning product developer or director at Carolina Biological Supply Company. So he will give us more information about next generation science standard, and it's about 3D learning with one of the examples from their product for BBS 3D. Now, Mr. Powell actually has approximately 20 years experience, imagine, in e-learning product development. And for the past 9 years, he performed e-learning development for Carolina Biological. He's also have 20 years experience for management, sales, and even project management experience. And Mr. Powell also is a skilled digital content developer, and he actually has a practical experience in K-12 education sector, particularly like, for example, in online delivery, like, for example, LMS, VLE, CMS, and even e-content such as e-learning courses and e-books. So that's actually really our speakers for today. They are really yeah.
To have them today. Now, to give us more information about Smithsonian, let's hear firstly from Dr. Carol.
Hi, my name is Dr. Carol O'Donnell, and I'm the Executive Director of the Smithsonian Science Education Center in Washington, D.C. in the U.S. Today, I'm going to talk to you about what does high-quality, three-dimensional science teaching and learning look like, and we'll use a real-world example about moving fresh water from where it is to where we need it. So, quick introductions. The Smithsonian is the largest cultural institution in the world. It's the largest museum, education, and research complex made up of 19 museums, 5 education centers, 9 research centers, a zoo, and we have 138 million objects, artworks, and specimens in our collection. Now, the Smithsonian believes in lifelong experiential learning. We love to see people engaged with objects and learning through objects. So what is the Smithsonian Science Education Center? We are the only organization within the Smithsonian that is focused specifically on bringing that same object-driven learning into classrooms, integrated, of course, with technology. We serve students and families all over the world through formal school systems. So our mission is transforming K-12 education, or education in primary schools and secondary schools, using science, through science. And we do that in collaboration with communities across the globe. We have 3 goals, which is to promote active inquiry-based STEM teaching and learning, to advance STEM education for sustainable development, and to ensure diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion in all that we do. So how do we achieve our goals? The first is that we develop curriculum in collaboration with Carolina Biological. We also develop digital assets that are integrated into that curriculum and also available to the public. We engage in professional development for teachers and leadership development for school systems, ministries of education, state education agencies. So I'm going to give you an example of what we consider to be high quality, 3-dimensional science teaching and learning. And when I say 3-dimensional, I mean focusing on disciplinary core ideas, so what students have to learn, science and engineering practice, how students learn, and cross-cutting concepts, those connective tissue between the disciplines and the engineering practices. At the Smithsonian Science Education Center, in the curriculum that we develop with Carolina Biological, what we do is we integrate science and engineering so that students in classrooms can engineer solutions to real-world problems and understand scientific phenomenon. In this particular session, I'm going to talk about a 5th grade module called How Can We Provide Fresh Water to Those in Need, which comes from our Smithsonian Science for the Classroom curriculum. That curriculum, Smithsonian Science for the Classroom, is made up of 24 modules from kindergarten, 5-year-olds, all the way up to 5th grade, 10 or 11-year-olds. And it cuts across 4 domains: life science, earth and space science, physical science, and engineering design. The module that I'm going to talk about today is how can we provide fresh water to those in need. Many of these modules start off by engaging students in either a scientific phenomenon or a problem. We would ask students to observe the scientific phenomenon, either an image, a video, or an actual hands-on investigation. We would ask them to think about, well, what do you notice when you observe the scientific phenomenon or the problem? And that what do you notice is, what are the things that students are observing? For example, in this image, they might say, I see that there's water. It seems like the water is moving. The water is going into the rock. Then the water disappears. We also ask them to think about, what do you wonder? And students, those are questions that students have. So students in this case might say, where did the water come from? And where's the water going? And if the water is going into the rock, how do we get the water back? And do we use the water for drinking? These questions that students ask might be put on a question board, and the questions will help drive student learning. And this is called engaging students in sense making. So in this case, for example, the application of that image to the real world is this is from the Edwards Aquifer in Texas. An aquifer is a place where water is stored, typically between two layers of rock. Now, the types of questions that students will ask when they engage in sense making of the phenomenon are really allowing the students to dig more deeply into the disciplinary core idea. I mentioned to you that a disciplinary core idea is one of 3 dimensions of 3-dimensional learning. It's the what of what students are learning. Some of the questions that students might have asked, I mentioned earlier, actually that help support the disciplinary core idea of the role of water on Earth's surface, is where does the water we need come from? How have humans impacted the water we need? How do we solve the problem of moving fresh water from where it is to where we need it? And how can we provide fresh water to those in need? The other dimension of three-dimensional learning is scientific and engineering practices. So unlike disciplinary core ideas, which are the what students will learn, scientific and engineering practices are the how students will learn. In this case, we might say to students, all right, so we just observed a phenomenon, and the phenomenon is that there's a full body of groundwater that's underneath the surface and between two layers of rock, and we call that an aquifer. But can we engineer a solution for how to get that water from where it is underground to where we need it on the surface? Now, clearly students can't engage directly with this phenomenon or problem in the classroom, so we would have them develop a model using an example to describe this scientific principle or phenomenon. So in this case, in this module, we would give students the following tools: 50 milliliters of water, 5 lengths of air tubing, a syringe, a 3-way valve, all the things you see in red. And then we would give them a set of criteria or goals, as well as a set of constraints or limitations. And this is typical in engineering a solution to a problem. Now, the criteria or goals might be, all right, so you have to pump at least 50 milliliters of water from the floor to the desktop. The water must travel from one beaker on the floor through 5 lengths of airline tubing to the other beaker on the desktop. And the constraint, you cannot move the beakers. You can only move the syringe and the 3-way valve during your testing. Now let's see what this looks like in the classroom. It's about a 2-minute video.
In this module, students explore water scarcity and design solutions to get fresh water where it is needed. The module is divided into 4 focus questions. Focus question 2 includes 5 lessons. In Lesson 5, students design and test a solution to the problem of accessing groundwater. In Lesson 6, students obtain information from text about Earth systems. Students gather evidence to explain how humans impact and are impacted by each of Earth's major spheres. In Lesson 7, students develop a model that shows how water moves through the Earth system. For example, precipitation can become groundwater and then be used in homes before it goes to a water treatment plant. In Lessons 8 and 9, students design and test a solution to a water pollution problem. In Lesson 5, students are challenged to model pumping groundwater to Earth's surface by pumping 50 milliliters of water from the floor to the desktop. Compared to Lesson 1, students have the additional constraint of only moving the syringe and 3-way valve during testing. If students have trouble figuring out how the 3-way valve works, point out that the switch has a word on it. After students test their design, they identify failure points in their system. For example, the connector and 3-way valve might leak or come apart. Students can solve this problem by placing the 3-way valve directly into the beaker. Students test their modified system and decide if the 2 tests together are a fair test or not. It is okay if students determine that the 2 tests were not a fair test. If students made more than one change between the 2 tests, they did not complete a fair test. In Lesson 8, students design a 3-step water treatment system. They can use a beaker, plastic cups, rubber bands, coffee filters, and a paper cup of activated carbon. While students are designing, the paper cup will be empty. Once they are ready to test their system in Lesson 9, they will get activated carbon in the paper cup. In Lesson 9, students should wear goggles and gloves because they use fertilizer and activated carbon. Add activated carbon to the paper cup in each group's water treatment kit. Set up 2 or 3 stations where students can contaminate the water they will use to test their water treatment system. Students test the nitrate level and clarity of their contaminated water before and after using their water treatment system. To test the nitrate levels, students put the nitrate strip in the water for 2 seconds, remove it, and wait 30 seconds before reading the results. Students should match the top square of the test strip to the nitrate plus nitrate row of the nitrate scale card. To test the water clarity, students place a white piece of paper behind the water and use the water clarity scale in the student activity guide to assign a water clarity level. In the next focus question, students will explore different solutions to the problem of getting fresh water where it is needed.
So if we go back to the students' questions, one of the questions students do ask is, how can we provide fresh water to those in need? And so what we do is we use technology and literacy to address water scarcity and water equity. Now, this is a complicated problem and too complex to do in the classroom directly. And so what we do is we provide a digital tool called Equation, which is a strategy game in which students have to manage the world's water and wealth to make sure that everyone on Earth has enough fresh water to meet their needs. And they win the game by redistributing Earth's fresh water so that every region has the amount of water that it needs. They also read about the unintended consequences of diverting freshwater sources for irrigation. In this example, for example, they read about the Aral Sea. Now, what do we mean by three-dimensional learning? I shared with you that there are several questions that drive student learning, and these questions come from students. So where does the water we need come from? How have humans impacted the water we need? How have humans tried to solve the problem of getting fresh water from where it is to where we need it? And that sequence of lessons is carefully designed with feedback from students and teachers all over the world so that we know that these lessons actually work well in the classroom and are based on the kinds of questions students will ask. The end of the module is an assessment, which is also three-dimensional. In other words, it's also an integration of disciplinary core ideas, cross-cutting concepts, and science and engineering practices. Now, some of the examples of three-dimensional learning, we said it's an integration of science and engineering practices. That's the first dimension, cross-cutting concepts, and disciplinary core ideas. In this example I shared, a disciplinary core idea was that the role of water in Earth's surface processes. In terms of science and engineering practices, some of the examples, and there are other science and engineering practices, might be students were asking questions, which is science, defining problems, which is engineering, developing and using models, planning and carrying out investigations, analyzing and interpreting data. In terms of cross-cutting concepts, students might have looked at cause and effect, they might have focused on systems or models, and they might have also looked at matter and energy, or movement of matter. So I'll end with this. Does this type of teaching actually work? The Smithsonian Science Education Center received a large grant in order to do a randomized control trial study to determine whether research-based curriculum, accompanied by professional development, material support so that they have all the hands-on equipment they need, and a good assessment and community support actually works. And what we found was that with a large sample of 125 schools, 16 school districts, 3 states in the United States, 60,000 students annually, and 1,900 teachers, of which we longitudinally followed 9,000 students over 3 years. These were the findings. Surveys showed that teachers felt more prepared to teach inquiry-based teaching and learning. Classroom observations show students demonstrated more collaboration and worked in teams to solve problems. Students were able to apply what they had learned to solving real-world science problems, and that the students who were the most underserved in schools actually scored higher than their students who were learning science in traditional ways. And finally, we learned that a digital hands-on integration an integration of digital into hands-on actually led students to not only improve their science learning, but they led to higher reading scores and higher math scores. And remember, we talked about the integration of literacy into this program as well, which I'm sure is responsible for the higher reading scores. So I want to leave you with this. It's a quick 1-minute video from a teacher who's used Carolina's curriculum in collaboration with the Smithsonian and demonstrate that this does actually make a difference with students.
there are so many ways that the Smithsonian trainings have impacted my teaching, but I think more importantly, it has impacted my students' learning. And there's one student that comes to mind, a little girl that I had last year, whose mother explained to me that she would not speak to me, nor would she look at me. And I needed to understand that she was a selective mute. She would speak at home or around people that she was familiar with, but not to expect her to talk to me or anyone else in class. So as much as I tried, I could never get her to be engaged verbally. She would write, but never verbally. We went through the school year from August all the way until May. We had set up our terrariums for our organisms unit. I had been telling the students that the millipedes would be arriving at school any day. So the day that they came, they were all so excited. I had everybody put on gloves and hold their hands out. And as I came around to this little girl and I placed the millipede in her hand, she spoke to me for the first time. And she said, "Wow, Mrs. Brown, this is awesome." And then she turned to her partner and began having a full conversation. And I think if nothing else, the Smithsonian has made that child's life, in my mind, so much more full.
So I want to thank you for spending time and giving me an opportunity to talk with you.
Thank you, Dr. Carl, for giving us more information about high-quality 3D science teaching and learning looks like using real-world problems to drive learning through integrated hands-on and digital with Smithsonian. Now, to give us more information about Carolina, we have here Mr. Powell. How are you, Mr. Powell? Thank you for being with us today.
Hello, everyone. I'm very good. How about you?
Yeah, we're doing great also. And we're so excited to learn more about Carolina Biological Supply Company and also to learn more about this NGSS and 3D science.
Thank you. So, in general, I will continue the topic that Dr. Carol started. And today I am going to be looking with you at the three-dimensional learning and inquiry-based science with using three different approaches. So the first, I'm going to be talking where they came from, yes, how they were developed, why they were developed, what were the specific things that drove educators in developing these standards. So that's the first thing. The second, I'm going to take a look with you at all those hallmark moments in a lesson that make it inquiry-based, that make it three-dimensional learning. And then finally, I'm going to show you an example of a curriculum that consists of the three-dimensional lessons. And I'm going to be using Carolina's Building Blocks of Science 3D program as kind of the example. And I give you a few information as to what the program is about. We don't have enough time to take you through all the details, but I'll do my best to give you as close introduction as possible. So I am going to share my screen with you now because I have a few slides prepared. Please let me know if you can see my screen now.
Yeah, we can see your screen, Mr. Powell.
Okay, perfect. So like I was mentioning a second ago, we are going to be covering the next generation science standards and three-dimensional learning. And the first thing I want to do is to explain why was there a development of these new standards? What makes them so unique and so universally used across, for example, the United States? Many teachers who are looking at these standards are seeing a need of them. So the first thing in these new standards, they were driven by what the student needs for the 21st century skills. Standards, for the most part in the US, at least in the past, had always been kind of the same state to state, that students were focused on this idea of so-called rote memorization. If they just knew enough, then they would become good students and good employees and innovate. But well, with the 21st century skills, there is actually a deep emphasis on this, and the college professors started saying that we, meaning teachers, very often are sending college students that are not prepared, sending students to college that are not prepared for the university. And so there were 4 groups that got together and developed a set of national standards. And those 4 groups were the National Research Council. This is a council, they do a lot of research in the US on all kinds of different topics. Then we have the National Science Teachers Association. They work with science education from kindergarten through college. We have the American Association for Advancement of Science. So this is the group that is centered around a simple goal of advancing science and science education through the country. And we have Achieve, who are the actual publishers of these new standards. So these 4 groups got together and started saying, we are finding out that our students coming out of high school are not prepared either for the workplace or the university. So what can we do to change that? They started getting together with employees, they worked with Microsoft, they worked with other big tech firms, they worked with universities, with elementary school teachers, high school teachers, to start to talk about what are the things we need to focus on as educators. What are those things we need to make sure we are doing at lower levels? What do we want students to be able to do? Then in 2011, they released a framework. It was a basic outline of what they were thinking for these new standards, and they released it. So people could give lots of feedback as to what they thought about the standards. They took that feedback, then when they went back and actually tweaked exactly what was taking place at each grade level to make sure that it's appropriate for the learner, appropriate for the teachers. And then in 2013, they actually released the new generation science standards and the 3-dimensional learning. So it was how these new standards were developed. So what is at the center of these standards after the development? What's actually at their heart? It is students having an all authentic real world experiences with science. The emphasis of just that idea, and I'll use physics as an example here. The idea that if a student is being able to say that, for example, a force is a push or pull on an object that changes its motion, this is not enough. Those students need to be able to experience a force and use that content in a way that they can apply it and they can use it to solve a problem. And so the focus in 3-dimensional learning and NGSS is students engaging in science inquiry, where they are the ones creating questions. They are the ones searching for answers, and they use a specific set of skills that are cross-curricular that extend past the science classroom. And so these standards were developed with that in mind, that experience of a student and the idea that they need to have more knowledge than just that content area. So in other words, what we don't want to see. We don't want to see teacher at the front of the class writing notes. We don't want to see bored students, but we want to see kids actively engaging in hands-on 3D learning, where they are collaborating, engaging in science discourse, and working like scientists and engineers, really engaging in those 21st century skills. So going back to the 4 organizations behind NGSS, they developed the standards to be based around what's called a performance expectation. When you first look at next generation science standards and 3D learning, you'll see a set of performance expectations. These are the learning goals for the student. And at the end of their kindergarten through 12th grade experience, there is a set of performance expectations that the students should be able to do. Now, each grade level in the NGSS takes some of these performance expectations. So there is a set of performance expectations at kindergarten that range in physical science, earth and space science, and life science. These performance expectations in kindergarten built with the first grade performance expectation, second grade performance expectation, third grade performance expectation, and all the way up. So these performance expectations are unique to the old standards that we used to have, where they were very discrete. In the kindergarten, the kids need to walk out just simply knowing those things. How they build is based on the dimensions of learning. So the performance expectation is the goal. The 3 dimensions of learning start with science and engineering practices. These are interesting because they don't change from grade level to grade level. They are the same through all grade levels. What we are doing is scaffolding these skills for a proper age development, because what we would expect from 18-year-old high school student is going to be different from the kindergartner. But the ultimate goal is still the same: science and engineering practices. I'm going to show you what those are as we go forward, but if these are the skills we want students to be able to have, they need to be able to experience the behavior that science and engineers engage in. We want students being able to show that they have the ability to work scientifically and work as engineer. And again, that's that fundamental difference between when you start looking at 3-dimensional learning. Scientists engage in science to explain a phenomenon, an observable event, while engineers try to solve a problem. And so as you go through the 3 dimensions of learning, you realize that students are constantly being asked to apply what they know to real-world situation, just like a scientist, or apply what they've learned to solve a problem, like an engineer. So we are trying to make sure that students are developing these critical thinking skills. And then the cross-cutting concept is the second part of the 3 dimensions of learning. This is a way of linking between linking different domains of science and school. So we are going to emphasize the student being able to, again, recognize patterns, similarities and differences, cause and effect, proportion, scale. These are the skills that go beyond just the science classroom. So the cross-cutting concepts, again, stay exactly the same from the kindergarten through high school, but the expectation is that as students move up through school, that they are getting better and better at cross-cutting concepts, just like the science and engineering practices. And so you see a scaffolding of this 3-dimensional learning as students move forward. Then we have the disciplinary core ideas. The disciplinary core ideas is the content aspect of this. The disciplinary core ideas changes as students move up kindergarten through 12th grade, but they scaffold just like the cross-cutting concept in the science and engineering practices do. As the students move up through their education, they keep building on those disciplinary core ideas and gain a deeper and deeper understanding of life science, physical science, and earth and space science. So we want to think about the analogy when discussing 3-dimensional learning and the next generation science standards. And when we think about this analogy, we often think about a rope. And this is what Dr. Carol was showing just a moment ago. A rope is a singular item, but it's made of smaller threads. So if you think about a rope as a performance expectation, that goal of the students, The three-dimensional learning is the threads that make up that rope. Each of those three things built into the performance expectation, the goal. So we don't want just students to be able to explain what a force is, but we want them to use that idea of a force as scientist and engineer. How does that explain a phenomenon that I see in my real world? How can I use the concept of a force to solve a problem? The cross-cutting concept. Can I recognize the pattern of a force? Can I recognize that what are the similarities and differences between different types of forces? And then the disciplinary core idea of understanding what a force is. So here is an example of a performance expectation. In this performance expectation, students are to construct and communicate models of a food web that demonstrate the transfer of matter and energy among organisms within an ecosystem. That is one singular performance expectation that a student will work with. That is their ultimate goal. But if you look, they are actually having to construct and communicate and model. That's one of those science and engineering practices. And here, we don't want students just to say what a food web is. The food web shows the change in matter and energy and ecosystem. And we want them to have that content, that disciplinary core idea, to recognize how to communicate it, how to construct a model of it, how to demonstrate it. And that cross-cutting concept of the transfer of matter and energy is one of those things that ties between physical science, earth and space science, and life sciences. That is kind of connection between the standard and three dimensions of learning. And so when you think about the three dimensions of learning and the standards, you have to understand these standards are not daily. Performance expectations are not daily goals for the teacher to meet. When we look back with the old standards, teacher would say, today I'm going to teach food webs. That is the goal. But these performance expectations are far fewer because you are teaching more with each one of them. For example, one performance expectation might be met through the entire 2, 3, 4 weeks worth of class as students gain those three dimensions of learning, where they are working on communicating, how they understand it, where they are working on the disciplinary core ideas. So, and this is a bit the same what Dr. Kalor said a moment ago. Why did we go this road? We went this road first off based on the research. They all say the same thing. Students learn more when they are engaged. Cognitive brain research shows that when a student has a hands-on experience about a topic, and then you ask them questions about that topic, regions of the brain light up that are different and unique than if you were just told about this topic. Literally, your brain is more active and has easier time recalling information and making connections when you are engaged in those three dimensions of learning to learn something. We also find with the research that students that are engaged in three dimensions of learning outperform their peers who are in the traditional setting of just simply that textbook lecture style instruction. There is also another reason why we focus on it, the need of a student. Students have significantly changed over the last half century, so to say, and the biggest part is the access to information. Our students have access to information that we as teachers could only dream about when we were at school. For example, my daughter knows that with a push of a button on her smartphone, she has access to all human information. She can push a button and find out what a force is. So the focus should be on how students use that information. That idea of needing to know all the information has been decreased because of technology, while the focus becomes how do you use that, and that's where it leads into those STEM careers. As the 21st century economy evolves, we are finding a need to be more flexible in our careers. That idea of engaging in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, those STEM-related careers are the future as we move forward, as technology continues to advance, and that's where the universities were telling school teachers, you weren't producing the students that are needed for those types of careers, and that you start to see that shift after using 3D instructions. The other thing are the skills that we developed in science. They go across all curriculum areas. For example, cross-cutting concepts are the same for the students who start working in kindergarten all the way through their senior year in high school. And you can recognize patterns, cause and effect. Those are the things that directly link to other curriculum areas. So why you see the improvement in mathematics, for example, why you see the improvement in reading, this is because that recognition of patterns helps in mathematics. Cause and effect helps in their English language, art courses, it helps in their history courses, and so on. Same with the science and engineering practices. Asking questions and defining problems. It doesn't matter whether the students are in the science classroom or history classroom. The idea of analyzing, interpreting data is key to the idea of understanding history. All of those things, engaging in argument for evidence, thinking using mathematical and computational thinking. These are things that the 3 dimensions of learning are centered around. So, if you are going to instruct in 3-dimensional learning, these are the things you need to look for. Or in other words, what does 3-dimensional instruction look like? If you were to say you wanted to start teaching in 3-dimensional instruction strategies, what would you want to start looking at? What do you want to make sure you are doing? So first off, it needs to be a phenomenon based. And you, as you look through 3-dimensional learning examples, you will see the word phenomenon over and over again, because it goes to that core of what scientists do. Scientists explain phenomenon, those observable events we see in the real world. And that's very important for today's student. Many times I was hearing from teachers that every year they would get some students who would ask the same question. Why do I need to know this, right? You hear that especially from middle school students. They say, well, why do I need to know this? How does this relate to my real world? And that's what kids want. They want to know how their the world works. Doesn't matter whether they are a kindergartner or 22-year-old student or myself. I want to know how the world works. And one of the big hallmarks of 3-dimensional instruction is giving the student that real world starting point. We want to see this because it explains that this is relevant to your world. Whether it's how roller coaster works or how plant grows, student wants to understand the world around them. The second is that hands-on, all authentic experience, providing students the opportunity to explore and solve problems, giving them that opportunity to see a food web, to see a cell, to see these things that they see in their everyday world happening and generate their own questions. They want to see how, for example, the erosion takes place and how they can stop it. They want to see how to use magnetism to solve problems. They want to see and show that they know things. They want to be part of the learning experience rather than just this passive participant. And so 3-dimensional learning, and you see that in the standards over and over again, where the students have to communicate. Students have to design a solution. They have to be that active participant, because again, it goes back to that other thing we were talking about. The research shows when students are active participants, they connect more. Their brains literally fire faster and make more connections at neurological level when they are the active participant. So the next is learning progression. We talked in the first part about how those the same cross-cutting concept, those same science and engineering practices build from the very first day of the student, when the student steps into the classroom, to the very last day they stepped out from the high school. These larger performance expectations have to be broken down into a progressive process. You cannot think of these performance expectations as just saying, today I'm going to cover this performance expectation. That is not a possibility because of the structure of these standards. This learning progression must be broken down to truly get the students to be able to do these 3 dimensions of learning. This is a process that starts at the beginning of the school year and goes to the very end. That we are not going just to say, for example, today we are going to look at patterns. Today we are going to look at cause and effect. It is an aspect that is interweaved into every instructional time period. And then the fourth is the assessment. In the 3-dimensional learning, assessment is just as important. We need to provide the students with the opportunities to show their understanding of the performance expectation, but they need to be able to do it in multiple ways, because the idea of having to communicate, to be able to make sure the students are recognizing sales, for example, scale and proportion, they are using their mathematical thinking. We need to make sure we have this 3-dimensional assessment that allows the students to explain those phenomena. And so when you think about teaching in 3 dimensions, you need to make sure that you are tying things to a real world experience. We are going to learn about the ecosystem because it relates to you and your life. And in this way, we are going to have a hands-on experience with an ecosystem, whether that's designing a pond, whether it's looking at living organisms or how they connect, developing your food web model. That hands-on experience, the learning progression, where they get the opportunity to use those cross-cutting concepts and those science and engineering practices repeatedly through the unit, and then as teacher, the assessment. So this all sounds like a difficult task for a teacher, but there are great curriculums out there that help in this process. And building blocks of science is one of them. And I'll take you through all 4 of these points and this curriculum will take you through all these 4 points and break them down. So just let's quickly take a look at the phenomenon as one of the examples. And I want to give you some examples of how the phenomenon can be engaged in every unit of building blocks of science. So in every unit there is so-called the anchoring phenomenon. That is the overall phenomenon of the unit, meaning the students may watch this video of a roller coaster in amusement park, and there's some narration that goes along with it. But ultimately, it's getting the students to say, we are going to be looking at an amusement park and how forces apply to an amusement park. While this one's unique, it also shows the learning progression. This is a 3rd grade unit in this case with this phenomenon, and they are looking there at the amusement park, but it ties to kindergarten unit where the anchoring phenomenon was a playground. Every kindergartner knows about the playground. They know sites, they know kickballs, they've played football. Well, now that learning progression takes them from a simple playground as kindergartner to a more complex playground and amusement park. And so that anchoring phenomenon is going to be the examination through the entire unit. Everything the students do is going to go back to the example at the amusement park, that real world connection. For example, in this unit, each lesson has what's called the investigative phenomenon. That investigative phenomenon is a small aspect. So let's just say when I go get on the ride with my friend, and because he and I are friends, he sits next to me. And the person running the amusement park may say to my friend, do you mind moving? Do you mind moving to the other side so the ride is more balanced? And the kids are asked, what did he mean by balanced? Why is that an advantage to the ride if it's balanced? And then the kids start to do a series of investigations that demonstrates what it means to be a balanced force, what it means in terms of motion, how we can use balance to estimate mass of a known object. So the students immediately engage based on this anchoring and investigative phenomenon with real-world experience to design and implement their own investigation to answer why. And if you look, that's the progression in every single lesson. It ties that anchoring phenomenon to the investigative phenomenon. The anchoring phenomenon allows students to have a context of what the instruction is about. And then in the lesson, you may see a performance expectation. Remember, we were talking about these larger performance expectations have to be broken down into disciplinary core ideas, the science and engineering practices, and the cross-cutting concept. So one lesson may last as long as 2 weeks, but during this lesson, we are going to focus on, say, these three in our example, performance expectations. But then we actually go to the instructional time and any given 30-minute instructional period for an investigation, you'll notice we don't break, we don't show the performance expectation. We look at just 3 dimensions of learning that are taking place. And so the investigation is what you would consider your daily activity, not the lesson. The lesson is that large chunk that may last multiple weeks, but the investigations are those smaller pieces of the performance expectation. So in this investigation, for example, it's what happens when objects collide. And this is just a sample video of what students would be doing. They are starting with just observing what happens when they smash 2 marbles together in a variety of situations. And so the disciplinary core idea they're examining is the conservation of energy. And that's the content. We are going to look at conservation of energy in collision, but they are also developing and using a model. Those marbles are a model of, for example, 2 cars in a car accident. It's a model, so if they can explain the marbles, they can also explain the cars, constructing explanations and designing solutions. They are going to be presented with a challenge question based on their observations. They are seeing the cross-cutting concept of cause and effect. They are seeing the idea of matter and energy being used. And so the students conduct these investigations, these day-to-day activities with specific dimensions. And then at the end of each of these investigations, students have the opportunity to be assessed in that 3 dimensions of learning. At the end of every single lesson, a teacher should be able to assign a real-world scenario that connects what they were talking about in a class to the assessment. And in this one, and I just switched topic to show you a different unit, it's the unit when we are dealing with astronomy and Earth and space science, where people can use stars to navigate and find direction. Some people even prefer to use stars instead of a compass. So explain how stars can help people find their way at night. And again, we've been talking about this investigation stars and fixed point stars and how they move. And now students have the opportunity to connect it with the real world by answering the tell me more question. And in general, I'd love to tell you much more about how building blocks of science is helping teachers to apply this 3-dimensional learning. But unfortunately, we are slowly running out of time. So just to summarize this product part, the Building Blocks of Science 3D provides a complete K through 5 curriculum program. It consists of 18 scaffolded units for kindergarten through grade 5 and 3 units per grade level, one in each physical, life, and earth and space sciences. And the engineering is integrated into the modules at each grade level. And this Building Blocks of Science 3D, a single module, will have everything teachers and students need to be successful in science. So what does it mean? We are simply supporting teachers with the challenge of meeting these innovations of science, this three-dimensional instruction. We are giving teachers the tools to provide students with opportunities to make sense of phenomena, to design solutions to the problems, giving them the tools to engage students in three-dimensional learning, to build coherent K through 5 learning progression, to deepen their understanding and creating lasting meaning and connections, as well as provide them with tools that align with language arts and mathematics. So how does Building Blocks of Science help teachers to do this? Simply, we provide everything for both students and teachers. Our phenomenons are our phenomenon-based approach and hands-on investigation is designed, for example, to fit into 30 minutes class session that engage students in this three-dimensional learning. Building Blocks is also a three-dimensional program in that it seamlessly integrates hands-on, digital, and print resources, providing support for all your students, no matter what the circumstances are. Printed and digital teacher guides, easy to use, step-by-step instruction, background information, formative and summative assessment. This is everything you as a teacher need to feel comfortable when teaching science. And literacy resources that really meet your students where they are by providing both on and below grade student readers. Readers that reference the information covered in the investigations, and they allow students to connect investigations to reader. So in general, Building Blocks of Science Unit Kit provide all the equipment you need to teach all your students, and this really helps to reduce those late night runs to the store to buy supplies. You get everything you need. So thank you for spending time with me today. I think it took me a little longer than I expected. But if you would like to learn more about Building Blocks of Science, we have a link here displayed. And it's a page with a set of online videos, webinars, and chats with Carolina consultants and educational trainers. And it helps to deeper understand the program, 3D learning, three-dimensional instructions. So hopefully you will find it beneficial.
Thank you very much, Mr. Powell. So we have, I think now will be like the question and answer portion. So we have here some questions available on our chat box. So one of them is, I'd like to see an example or idea of how they assess these experimental learning practices. Is there a rubric or checklist that teachers can use throughout K-12, for example?
So I understand this question as the assessment strategies. So in three-dimensional instruction, the assessment is also three-dimensional. So and in both programs, in Smithsonian program and in Building Blocks of Science program, the assessment is also three-dimensional. Of course, we also provide teachers with what we call the summative assessment, so that they can test the whole class. But after each investigation, during each single 45-minute session, students are provided with a special piece of paper where they write their observations from the investigation. And this is what teachers are seeing, and they can also assess students whether they understood the investigation and what they were doing there by just looking at this piece of paper or by checking what questions students are asking. Yes, well, because this is students' role to ask the question to the investigation. So there's a variety of ways to test students, to assess students. And the good thing is that in both programs, in Building Blocks of Science and in the Smithsonian Science for the Classroom, we are providing teachers with all these assessments, so you don't have to worry about it. Yes, it's just click and download the proper piece of paper, which is designed for the particular investigation, for the particular lesson. So you just take it and use it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Powell. There's also questions here about at-home learning. Like if in case, so it's mentioned there that they will have a hands-on kit. What if the students are at home? They can do a 3D dimensional learning?
Yes. The good thing that the unfortunate event, which is COVID-19, also forced us as publishers to work more on the digital part of the program. So in both programs, again, we have a really strong digital representation of the content. And even if a school closes and you have to start doing the remote learning, we have an online platform where you will find lots of resources and also pre-recorded videos with those investigations, which you can play for your students. And this investigation is without any voiceover, without any comments. It's just the investigation, sometimes a set of iterations of the same investigation. And with your students, you can watch it and simply apply this inquiry-based method all the time. So the way how the method is used, it doesn't change. It's just a different medium to do the same thing. And sometimes you can always ask students to, find some marbles at home or some other things, and they can still try to experiment at home. It all depends on the topic and particular investigation. But you can continue using the program with distance learning with students at home without any problems.
Thank you, Mr. Powell. There's another question. Our school follows national curriculum. How can we use NGSS in our curriculum?
As I was explaining during my presentation, as Dr. Carl was saying, NGSS, three-dimensional learning, is just a different way of introducing the same topics which you have with your national curriculum. Yes, so it's just the topics are the same. You are still teaching students about what the force is, but the way of giving them this knowledge is slightly different, because we simply ask them to ask questions and generate the answers. So I sometimes I give the example of a sun. You can ask your student, okay, when the sun goes down, it changes color from bright yellow to orange, for example. What do you think about it? Yes, why the sun is changing this color? How this is happening? So it's the same with topics with the national curriculum. There are different topics, but they are addressed in a different way. So yes, you can use it.
Correct. So really, we learn a lot for today's webinar. So I think we learned a lot about NGSS, about three-dimensional learning. We want to ask more questions from our attendees, but I guess we already reached our time. So like for more information of our teachers or our attendees, you could also contact us on the following informations that you could see on our screen. So we are also directly contacted with Carolina and Smithsonian Science Education Center.
So we want to thank you for your time today. We wish you a very happy day, and thank you.
Thank you very much also, Mr. Powell, for having us today.
Thank you. And if any of the attendees will have questions related to Smithsonian Science for the Classroom or our Building Blocks of Science kits, or in general NGSS and three-dimensional learning, you can always reach out to us directly or through Knowledge Hub, and we will be happy to answer your questions.
For sure, they will have lots of questions later on. Yeah, and also most of the teachers are asking also for the recording session, so we'll share it with them.
Okay,
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, Mr. Paul.
Thank you. Thank you for invitation.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye bye. Take care.
Bye bye. Bye bye.